Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be continuing our coverage of the 1972 World Chess Championship between Spassky and Bobby Fischer. Bobby Fischer does hold a 3-game lead, but the last 3 games have been draws. So while it seemed like there was a winner almost every round or every other round, we have had some draws. Seems like Bobby Fischer is almost content having draws. He's had some very strong positions, but doesn't want to put himself ever in a position where he could start to drop some games to his opponent. So playing very strong, but also going for some draws that he may not have in the beginning of this tournament. So in game 17, we have Spassky playing the white pieces, Bobby Fischer defending with the black pieces. Spassky starts out with pawn to e4, pawn to d6, pawn d4, just controlling the center. Pawn to g6, knight to c3, and then knight to f6. This is the Pirc defense, not a common defense. This had never been played at the World Championships before. And for Bobby Fischer, he had never played it in competitive chess. So not something you're used to seeing at this level. Most players, even today, are going to be playing more the Grunfeld with pawn to d5. Similar setup, but you can see how different it is for your pawns to say back here on the 6th rank compared to pushing forward and counterattacking in the center of the board. This is truly a hyper-modern defense, meaning Black's trying to control the center with his minor pieces, not pushing forward with his pawns, and then later on, he can start to push in the center. He could play pawn to e5, attack the center of the board, pawn to c5. Black wants to make sure he's not passive and just lets his opponent continuously push up the board. What doesn't want to have some counterplay, but depending on where his opponent goes, because there's a few places that White could go from here. You have the Austrian attack, more the main line with pawn to f4. And so in this case, Black may want to counterattack on the queen side of the board. Or could decide to just come to e5 and counterattack in the center with such a strong attack from White. You could also see knight to f3. This is more of a quieter opening from White, not trying to be too aggressive, just normal development, bring his light square bishop out, castle on the king side. Could also just bring bishop here to c4, and you'll see this a lot of times. Once the pawn here on d6 comes out, Black's going to be developing along the dark square. So if the pawn comes down here to e5 or even down here to c5, this still allows this light square bishop to attack this long diagonal, specifically the square here on f7, which is a huge weakness for Black early on since the king is the only piece protecting that. So this seems like a logical move. Also, we've seen some plays in recent days for with pawn to f3. From there, you many times could see White castle on the queen side, really have a strong attack. And when your opponent's playing somewhat passive early on, having a strong attack many times is a good option. We see Spassky playing the main line of the Austrian attack, the pawn to f4, and then bishop to g7. This was always going to be the next move for Bobby Fischer, getting ready to castle on the king side. We see knight to f3, and then pawn to c5. So did have some options, but at the end of the day, chose to play pawn here to c5. Now, Spassky can go ahead and take this pawn if he wants to, or if he wanted to get his light square bishop involved into the game, could play bishop to b5. This does, set up bishop to d7, pawn up here to e5. Attacking the knight. Knight comes down here to g4, pawn h3. So this is one option, but Spassky decided to just go ahead and take that pawn here, saying, yeah, I'm going to open up the door for my queen to get involved. The queen comes down here to a5, does not want to take the pawn and then to lose his queen up here and have to take with his king here on d8. He would lose the option to castle. So queen down here to a5. This does pin down the knights here on c3 to the king. It also attacks this pawn here on c5. We see the bishop here to d3, and there's it really depends on how aggressive White wants to be here. You could play bishop here to d3 as he did. Could also play bishop to b5. Check. And so, depending on how Black wants to continue here, we're going to see bishop to d7 more than likely stopping this. This is mostly how you want to defend this. So if your opponent does take, you could retake with your knight. This is protecting your knight here on f6 as well. Also, another attacker on the square here on c5. But after the bishop comes to d7, how does White continue here? And there's a few options that you would see if you were to play this in your own game. One would be for the queen to go ahead and try to come out. So queen to e2, maybe queen to d3, a couple different options here to try to control this pawn here on e4, since you do have the knight here on f6 attacking it, or you could just go ahead and take with your bishop here on d7. White's usually not looking to give up their light square bishop this early, since it is such a strong attacker in this opening, especially knowing that black doesn't have to give up too much as far as his game plan here, because he wants to be playing something like knight to d7. This still allows for semi-open file for his rook to come over to c8. Castles on the king side. Very good opening for black. But if white does not do this, if he plays something like queen to e2, well, this queen on a5 is sort of a nuisance, pinning down this knight here on c3 to the king here, but it seems like a logical move. Unfortunately, after knight to e4, things get very complicated for white. We could see the bishop take here on d7. Okay, perfect, but still in a predicament here. If the queen takes, now the bishop could come down. It was on g7, fianchettoed, just waiting to attack, and that's exactly what you do in these hyper-modern defenses. After the pawn takes, queen comes down here, check, and then all of a sudden you could see this queen is setting up to attack here on a1, and the king here on f2 is just not in a good spot. Now, if we come back and say, what if the queen doesn't come here to e2? What if it comes up here to d3? Still the same thing. Yes, it is defending this knight here a little bit better, but knight can still come down here to e4. Not going to be doing too much here. If the queen takes, then the bishop's just going to fall right here. Bishop could take, and then if the knight takes, then you could have the queen take, and since the knight can't take here, just going to be giving up that material. So that's not going to be a great option. After the queen takes, bishop comes down here to c3, pawn takes, and then queen down here, check. Same situation as before, so this is not a great option as well. Black can really develop how he wants to, has a strong attack. White's not going to be castling on the king side of the board anytime soon. So while it does look like there's a lot of different options, at the end of the day, Spassky looked at it and said, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and play bishop here to d3. Queen to c5, gobbling up that material. So both sides equal in material now. Queen to e2, castle on the king side. Bishop here to e3. Does have the option now to castle on either side of the board. This is attacking the queen. Queen comes back here to a5, and then castle on the king side. Bishop down here to g4, so pinning down the knight to the queen right here. Rook over here to d1, getting to a semi-open file, wants to have a strong attack here. The knight here on c3 is defending this square here on a2, but does have to keep in mind if the knight were to ever move, then his knight would be under attack from the bishop, and since that is, the only way to get that piece back would be to play pawn to c3. Double pawns here also opens up the door for the pawn on a2 to fall. So a lot of stuff that white has to worry about. Black definitely has a stronger attack, in my opinion, on this board state. Now Bobby Fischer plays knight to c6, getting his last piece developed into the game. Bishop here to c4. And then knight to h5. And this is a really good move from Bobby Fischer. If you look at what he's trying to do here, the knight here on c3 is a big weakness, as we talked about. The only pawn or piece protecting this is the pawn right here on b2. But then the knight, if it were to fall, it's only protecting this pawn here on a2. So yes, the bishop here on c4 is now protecting the pawn, but white's really forced into this weird place where he really is just defending. He's not really attacking his opponents. All of a sudden, Bobby Fischer plays knight to h5, attacking this pawn here, and now the bishop here on e3 is forced to play defender role, and so most of the attacking is coming from Bobby Fischer. Now we see the bishop come back here to b3. Because there's so much pressure with the queen and the bishop here on g7, I think another option could have been from here to play rook to d5. White doesn't have a lot of other great options here. You can't play something like pawn to h3 trying to attack the bishop, because then the knight could just come down here to g3, forking the queen and the rook here. So that's not a good option here. With the bishop and the queen both attacking this, I think you have to force the queen away. Something like rook here to d5. Not easy for black to deal with this right away. Can always bring his rook over to d1 if he wants to double up here. But this forces black's hand, where bishop back here to b3, it's not really doing much more than it was before. It's still just defending the same square here on A2. Wasn't worried too much about this pawn here on C2. So Bobby Fischer says, yeah, I'm going to continue with my game plan. I'm going to come down here, take this knight here on C3. After the pawn takes, then the queen can recapture. Bobby Fischer is up in material, so things are looking good for him. Pawn to F5, so starting to push forward. Knight to F6, pawn to H3, so can finally start to push and try to get that bishop to move. Does decide to go ahead and take a material here on F3, so takes the knight. Queen recaptures. Knight here to A5, attacking the bishop. Rook up here to D3, forcing the queen to move. But now the queen has an easy place to come back here to C7. It's still very involved into the action, and it just keeps this bishop here on B3 pinned down, defending this pawn right here on C2. Bishop comes up to a G6, and then knight down here to B3, taking that bishop. And if you look at it and say, well, yes, can't the bishop just take the rook here on F8? He can, but unfortunately, it's not going to be that great a move. After the bishop takes, then you're going to have the knight up here to C5, attacking the rook. And then, okay, what does white do from here? If he wants to just come to E7, he's going to lose his rook, and there's still not a great way for him to escape. If we see something else, maybe the bishop come back here to H6, then knight takes on D3 as we talked about after the pawn takes. At the end of the day, white's not better for this. So we don't see the bishop take here on F8. Instead, we see just the pawn take on B3. Now, queen to C5, say check. So not worried about the rook right now since white is under attack. King over here to H1, and now queen to E5. And this is the one spot where I think Bobby Fischer played suboptimally. It is almost like he gave up trying to go for it after this. He had a great position right here. All he really has to do is play, just rook to E8. Keep his rook safe, that's fine. He doesn't have a strong attack just with his queen on board. There's so much protection that white has over here. There's no reason to do anything else besides protect your rook right here. But in the game, Bobby Fischer decides to go and play queen to E5, and then the bishop takes here on F8. Rook takes on F8, so white does go up in that exchange. Rook to E3, rook over here to C8, pawn takes, and then queen up here to F4 says, hey, do you want to go ahead and exchange material right here? And after Bobby Fischer takes, then we pretty much are aware that Bobby Fischer wants to go for a draw in this position. There's no reason for you to give up a rook for a bishop unless you have a strong attacker. You say, yeah, the tempo game means more to me. I have the pieces I need. But when you go ahead and give up your most powerful piece on the board here, you pretty much have a game plan where you know you can get a draw. You're up 3 points in the tournament, so why try anything else? And that's exactly what Bobby Fischer is looking to do here. So knight to D7, rook down here to F2, knight to E5. So this is just a centralized outpost that white can't really do anything about. Black can sit here the rest of the game if he wants to. King here to H2. Rook down here to C1. So trying to get behind enemy lines. White for right now is going to be just moving his rooks back and forth, trying to protect this back line. Knight here to C6. Rook here to C2. And so Bobby Fischer can make sure that white cannot get his rook past here if he wants to. So depending on where white is, Bobby Fischer can just move this knight back and forth here. But rook to C2 says, hey, if you want to go and exchange off your rooks, that'd be fine. I think in that position, Spassky would go ahead and win the game. Rook versus a knight in game usually favors the rook, especially, with pawns only up one pawn for Bobby Fischer. Should be an easy game for Spassky. Bobby Fischer not looking to do that. Rook to E1, attacking the pawn. Rook to E2, just kind of back and forth. Not trying to give up his rook here. Just keep it behind. Continue to attack his opponent. Both sides moving their rooks back and forth. We do see some one-fold, two-fold repetition. Rook here to E1. Rook to e2, rook to f1, rook up here to e3, pushed a little bit, pawn to a6, but you can see not much is changing in the position. They keep moving back and forth here. White could, if he ever wanted to, take with his rook here on c6 after the pawn captures, then could recapture. But then he knows he's going to lose material back here, so he's not going to have the advantage that he'd be looking for. Rook here to e1, rook over here to c2, pawn here to g5. No real way for either side to really come out of this ahead. And so we do see a threefold repetition after move 45, and so the players at this point had a draw. So, great game. Not a defense we see very often. I feel like Bobby Fischer played it exceptionally well. Towards the end of it, I think he had the advantage and he could have played for a win, but he may have looked at and saw some variations that were a little trickier than he wanted to go down, and so at the end of the day, played for a draw, was able to, in a few moves, get to a position where it was a draw state, and it was just a matter of execution, make sure he did not slip up. So going into game 18 with the white pieces, Bobby Fischer holds a 3-game lead. So hopefully you guys enjoy this video, you're enjoying the series, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.